grateful for Clara, Reverend Clara over here. This is Sister Bradley of IPL, and myself and Lynn to work together on this first of series that the Conference of Churches is going to have. And she wanted the first one to be about Earth and climate change, and that's what Interfaith Power and Light does here in New Mexico. But we're also working in El Paso and the region around El Paso. So we kind of changed our name to New Mexico and El Paso region Interfaith Power and Light, and we're very pleased about that. So I'm just very happy that you're here today. And we're doing something kind of a little different. And I do want to mention before I start that we have some information on this table over here, and some of our books that we read, or you might want to just browse. And there's a petition there to sign for rulemaking for all these gas pipelines that we have all over the country that are not monitored. And so this rulemaking under the Department of Transportation is to do that. So we work a lot with oil and gas things in various ways because of climate change and energy and all of that. So anyway, without further ado, we want to get started here. And we're doing kind of a fun thing, I think, this morning, and sort of experimental. We have two, I don't want to say guinea pigs, but they don't look like that, but two wonderful people, Bishop Hunn and Reverend Talitha Arnold, and they graciously said yes to having a conversation this morning. So the context for this is, and we're not going to be a moderator because we wanted them to go more deeply into some questions and some short material that we gave them to read as prompts for this particular moment that we're living in, which is a kind of a poly-crisis moment where there's a lot of social kinds of things going on. COVID and what happened during COVID sort of brought to the surface a lot of societal things, and then in the overarching, I believe, is climate crisis that is affecting everything in terms of economics, economic inequity, disasters, even mental health, especially of young people and young adults and others, and sometimes even sort of a malaise that is over our in our atmosphere, causing us to feel like kind of hopeless or depressed, or what do we do, or how do we live in this moment. And as people of faith leaders and of different religious traditions, we have a particular and very important role, I believe, that is evolving, and we have lots of questions. How do we do this in this kind of a time? How do we move into the future with climate change? How do we not just address this, but integrate it into everything we do? How do we do this, especially when we see congregations becoming more and more white hairs? I love white hairs. I have a few. I don't have a whole lot yet, but I do have some too. And not so many younger folks, and where sometimes it feels like, well, this doesn't speak. But I think we're into a moment where it's ever more deeply essential, maybe than any other time, for this spiritual, ethical, moral kind of place in our culture, society, and then how do we help others enter into that or grow together into it, into new ways and new places and new expressions? How do we evolve as religious traditions in this moment? So that's kind of the context for this conversation this morning. And so before I turn it over to Bishop Hunn and Reverend Talitha, I just want to give just a little brief kind of intro. They're going to be talking about themselves and talking with each other. We're going to have time for questions at the end. And so if you have thoughts, ideas, questions to bring up, please jot those down, because we want this to be a larger conversation also. But I wanted to just introduce them briefly. And I've known Talitha, not intimately, but for quite some time. Their congregation, the United Church of Santa Fe, has invited me several times to be there, and I've attended other events with them. And Talitha is the pastor there and has been for many years. And she's very rooted in this place, has a great love for the earth, and has helped her congregation live that out. They have solar, they have done things with the plants, the landscape, their programming, advocacy engagement, etc. But what I wanted to share about Talitha was something that I found that fits right into today, I think. In fact, she was talking about this earlier before we started. And she said, what I try to be about a growing church is saguaro theology. The saguaro cactus, that magnificent big cactus with arm-like branches, puts out as many roots underground as growth above ground. It can grow up to 50 feet with 50-foot wide roots. And it takes from 150 to 200 years to grow. Tumbleweeds grow real fast, real big. The minute they hit a dry spell, they shrivel up and blow away. A saguaro can be 60 years old and be only 4 feet tall. So shouts to some of you that are shorter out there. That is how things last in the desert. This is the kind of church I want to be. Wow. So that's just a little intro. She'll be sharing more. And then with Bishop Hunn, I just want to share, he wears cowboy boots, which I think is great. He keeps those out here. And he grew up in Texas and New Mexico area. And he travels all over because they're, the Episcopal Diocese of the Rio Grande covers New Mexico, but also West Texas. And I could say a number of things about it, but I want to refer back to something that happened about a year and a half ago. The Episcopal Diocese invited me and another gentleman to give a keynote at their annual gathering with all of their big leaders. It was in the cathedral in Albuquerque. And he began, before we started speaking, he said something about, and I was really rather impressed because it takes a lot of courage to do this, but he said, our diocese covers the whole Permian Basin and all of New Mexico. We are responsible worldwide for a great part of climate change with the oil and gas in the Permian Basin. And he said, I know people here are on both sides of this, and politically they're in both sides, but we have to address this and talk about this and somehow be with this in our Episcopal Diocese. And he said, I know we can do that because we come together every weekend for worship together. And so I was very moved by that. So I am looking forward to this deep conversation this morning. So I'm going to invite you both up. And again, just jot down thoughts, questions, because we want this to be a larger conversation as well. Thank you all again for coming today.
So we should probably do a little microphone check. Is this working?
Hey, yeah. Is this working? Yeah, it is good. All right, so we can go lead. That's great. Well, we talked a little bit before. Joan has, I want to thank you so much, for offering this opportunity. And she had sent us a couple articles ahead of time with some prompting questions. And then also just shared with us the handout that you all have, sort of with the 7 things that the priest from Ireland has recommended with regard to things of environmental issues. And also, Joan was very clear that she was not going to be the moderator. We were just going to have a conversation, which is great fun. And we thought beginning with perhaps, since all politics is local and all environment is local, to begin a little bit with sharing what the landscape of our own lives has been, and as a way of also thinking about the landscape of your lives. Because one of the things about at least what we formally sort of mainline Protestant churches in the Southwest is that many of them are composed of people who moved here from very different climates and from very different environments, much more green, as well as Steger once wrote, in the West you have to get over the color green. So, what was the environment you grew up in? What has shaped you?
Well, so good morning, everybody. My name is Michael, and I'm currently serving as the Bishop of the Diocese of the Rio Grande, as you heard. And I grew up here. I was actually born in Northern California, but my earliest memories were from here in New Mexico, in White Rock, just next to Los Alamos. We were in Los Alamos because my dad, who is right here, hi Dad, thanks for coming. To the packed audience with family. So my dad was doing passive solar energy research, and the Department of Energy was big into that in the 70s under the Carter administration. And he and my mom designed and built a passive solar home that we lived in growing up. That was one of the first, maybe the first trauma wall residential. It was an experiment. So we grew up living in an experiment that actually worked. But there were both architectural people and energy people who would come literally as tourists to see our house. And I remember, like, sometimes you'd be at the breakfast table and you'd look out and there were these folks from Japan with their cameras taking pictures of our house. So it's at 300 Valle del Sol. You can go and see it. It's still there, and the trom wall still works, and the sun still shines. So I grew up with that. We were in Los Alamos not for weapons, but for passive solar energy. And we left when the Reagan administration came in and changed the direction of energy policy.
So we arrived.
And then we moved to, I was 13, and we moved to Austin, Texas, where Dad ran the Center for Energy Studies at University of Texas in Austin. So that's sort of my dad's side. When we were in Austin, my mom, who is also here,
You really did back me up.
Yeah. Mom was the archivist at the Historical Museum in Los Alamos. So in the building where the ranch school was, and my sister and I, as kids, spent a lot of time after school, and particularly during summers and holidays, in the Historical Museum, hanging out with Mom and being there. But one of Mom's passions was documenting indigenous rock art. And so my earliest memories were literally following her through the canyons around the Pajarito Plateau. She had maps and a camera and a measuring stick, and my sister and I would climb everything. So she'd walk down the middle of the canyon, and Susie and I would climb all the stuff. And we were looking for caves, and we were looking for petroglyphs, and we would say, "We found one, Mom," and then she'd come and bring the measuring stick and the camera and the map and document where and what the rock art was. So I grew up. Los Alamos is a strange place to grow up as a kid. The elementary school science fair is off the chain.
It's really hard to win.
Yeah, when my sister and I moved to Austin, I remember we walked into the science fair, and both of us went like, "We're winning this thing." People had just like a poster board with some pictures of flowers on it. Like, oh. Anyway, so there was this strange kind of global, international, but scientific and highly educated community that we lived in. I grew up thinking that all adults had PhDs, because everyone I knew. And I thought that no adult ever talked about work. Because it was all classified. So, literally, nobody could talk about work. And so they all had all these other interests. And so that was sort of one part of my formative years. And the other part was with Mom learning about how the famous Padre Maria in San Ildefonso made her pottery. And I remember, we studied and learned about. We were always down in San Ildefonso for the ceremonies, and we were in the canyons learning about the indigenous peoples there. And so I was 13 in Austin, Texas, when I realized I was white. And I've been sort of, and not because of the kind of, I hesitate to say that in some ways, because I don't want you to think that it's because of the kind of invisibility of whiteness. It was that I grew up in a place where people were not talking actively about race, and so I learned about racism by experiencing it as a part of the mandatory busing program in Austin, Texas. So that began my sort of awareness that my internal concept of who I think I am and what the world sees are not the same thing, and that I need to be constantly negotiating that. both in terms of my own identity and what that legacy brings with it into the room, but also in the sense of trying to make connections across divides of race and culture and language, etc. My ancestors settled in Arizona in the 1850s, 1860s, actually shortly after that in the Civil War period. And they were teachers, school teachers and ranchers, raising mostly goats in places around Arizona, Prescott, Bumblebee, that sort of area. My great uncle was maybe one of the first spokesmodels for Levi's, because he was a rodeo champion, and we still have photographs of his Levi's ad from like the 19-teens. And my great aunt Claire, we grew up going to her house, and she wrote a book called Ranch Trails and Short Tales. It was about her experience growing up. She was really smart. She waited for everybody else in her generation to die, and then she wrote a book about it. And in that book, she talked about things like the kind of gardening that she raised in Arizona. Raising 2 kids, and it was all horseback. So she would, if you just think about being a woman on your own, because the men folk were out running after the goats and stuff. And she had 2 little ones, and so she would put them in a sling and hang them in a tree, so she could get on her horse and then ride up to the tree, and then take the slings off the tree and put the babies on either side so she could ride to the market. So she was serious, and so that kind of southwestern landscape and land, awareness of the sun and the heat, the awareness that water is scarce, awareness of, I still feel oppressed when I go to the east, because it just feels like, where's this God? This is the landscape that calls to my soul. After we left Austin, I didn't come back to New Mexico for 25 years, something like that, and I was accompanying my boss on a trip visiting this diocese. We walked off the plane into the Albuquerque airport, and I felt in my gut, I almost knelt and kissed the ground in that airport, because that airport doesn't look like anywhere else. And we spent that 4-day visit with me reeling about reconnecting to this land that was calling me here. So I'll just jump quickly to say I'm a permaculture and organic gardener. Learned to garden in the East. I've relearned a lot of those principles now that my wife and I, she's the actually president of the Sandoval County Master Gardener, so she's like the master gardener with the credentials. I'm the hack who's been failing at it for 25 years and sort of succeeding. So we live in Corrales, where we are working on a permaculture orchard. It is on less than a quarter of an acre, and we have 34 types of fruit trees growing, as well as berries and gardens and other sorts of things. So we're concerned about water tables and also about growing food and sustainability in that way. So that's just sort of my personal sense. But who are you?
I'm Talitha Arnold, and
Excuse me. Could you use the microphone, please?
Is it not?
It's
Is it not
on.
picking up?
They're on. Here, Kevin,
I'm happy to use it.
Kevin, sit right over here.
That's easier.
You have to, it's on.
If it gets closer, is that better?
Everybody else here?
this one's not.
Yeah, it's on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
I'll also use my 4-H voice.
Yay!
So, thank you very much, Joan, for this opportunity. Like Michael, I grew up in the Southwest. I grew up in the Phoenix and Tempe area of Arizona. My grandmother on my mother's side had come from Oklahoma as a young woman in 1905, 1906 by herself. What was then the Arizona Territory. And the family story was that she had come because of hay fever, which made sense, except that after she passed away when I was in high school, and my mom and I, my older sister, went to Oklahoma reason she had moved by herself as a young woman to Arizona, 1905 or 06, was that she had gone to a dance with a young man of whom her parents disapproved. And when she came home, her bags were on the front steps. And they were tough Germans. They were German-American background, and you did not cross your parents in those days. And so she moved out she went and lived with the banker's family for a couple of weeks. It was a small town, Broken Arrow, outside of Tulsa. And then he finally found her a job as a bookkeeper out in the Arizona Territory, and she moved out there. Met my grandfather, who had come there from California by way of being a bookkeeper down in Bisbee, Arizona, about the same time. They married and owned the first store south of the Salt River in the Phoenix Valley. They lost it during the Depression. But anyway, once I still remember driving out of Broken Arrow the next morning and having met with this friend who told me the true story about my grandmother's migration. Turning to my mother and saying, "That's a far cry from hay fever." And she said, "Yes, you're right." Anyway, so I grew up somewhat similar. It's interesting. We both have somewhat similar backgrounds of growing up in scientific families. My mother had the opportunity, even though her father had passed away, to go to the University of Arizona in the late 1930s. She majored undergraduate in botany and then got her master's degree in plant pathology and microbiology. And in fact, with her master's thesis, had discovered bacterium that was ravaging the saguaros at that time. And you know, when you're growing up, your parents are your parents, and you sort of assume, well, this is who they are. My father also had come from California. They met as students down at U of A, and he was a desert botanist, working primarily on birds and mammals. He was a desert biologist. And they met, and they actually got married at St. Philip of the Hills Church in Tucson, which was at that time on the very outskirts of Tucson. And instead of a stained glass window outside at the back of or at the front of the church, it was a clear glass window that opened out into the beautiful Episcopal Church, opened out into this wonderful stand of saguaros and ocotillos and choyas and all kinds of desert plants and red rock, etc. And I think they fell in love with the Episcopal Church, with one another, and by falling in love with the desert as well. So, my parents married before World War II, but then didn't have children until after the war had ended. My father had a 10% disability coming out of the war, and about 10 years later, right before I was born, they had lived all around the West because he was working with the Fish and Wildlife Service at that point. They actually lived in Albuquerque for a couple, 3 years, and he was doing research here on golden and bald eagles. And I was saying to Michael that my three older siblings, my two older brothers and my sister, were all baptized at St. John Cathedral here in Albuquerque. So there's some strong connections. He unfortunately was hospitalized just a few months before I was born, and because he was managing a wildlife refuge at that point up in the northeastern corner of South Dakota, when he couldn't work, my mom had no place to live, 3 little kids, pregnant with me, so she moved back to South Phoenix to live with her mother on what she thought was going to be a temporary basis. It turned out not to be. My father died a couple of years later. And actually, speaking of front walls and adobe walls, the first house that I grew up in for the first 5 years of my life was an adobe house in South Phoenix, Arizona. Adobe had been used in the early 1900s as a material there, but in the 1930s had been outlawed because of earthquakes. It was also because of the construction industry's lobby against adobe. But I still remember that house because the adobe part of it was cool, and because my grandmother all of a sudden had 5 extra people living with her, she added on a cinder block room, and the temperature difference between the adobe and the cinder block was about 15 degrees every year. My mother had intended to continue as a research microbiologist. She worked for the Cutter Laboratories doing penicillin research during World War II. But after my father died, she needed the same schedule as schedule. This is pre-childcare days, school schedule as her kids, and so she became a middle school science teacher, for which there is a special place in heaven, I think. They did that for 25 years, raising the four of us on her own. My own journey was that as I said, I grew up in South Phoenix and then Tempe, and then went to college in Southern California and used to go to seminary on what was a trial year basis. And one of the reasons I went to the East Coast for seminary was I'd grown up in even though my parents had been Episcopalian, when my mom moved back to Arizona, the Episcopal Cathedral was downtown and she didn't have a car, and so she went back to the neighborhood congregational church that she'd grown up in South Phoenix, which was a very caring community, working class, farming class, had women's groups that met at night so that a single mom with 4 kids could be part of the women's fellowship. We moved to Tempe and moved up an economic notch. The family culture changed at that point. It was still the days of Ozzie and Harriet, so there were some challenges there in terms of fitting into either congregational or Episcopal churches. And but the church that I grew up in Tempe looked like it came off the green in New Haven or Vermont or something. It was a white steeple church with a slant roof to keep the snow off in the snow-and desert. We sang in the bleak midwinter, snow on snow. A little bit of cognitive dissonance there. But at the same time, having a mother who was a desert biologist, a desert botanist, I also knew that the Middle East did not look like northern New England. It looked like the Arizona Sonora Desert. And so that notion of being deeply rooted in the Christian faith and also deeply rooted in creation was always a part of my own growing up. That God was experienced both in that wonderful mainline Protestant theological understanding of the Bible, understanding of who Jesus was, all of that background, and at the same time also knowing that number one, there were people who were living in Arizona who had been praying in that landscape a lot longer than basically white Anglo-Saxon Protestants had been there, and also that the earth itself, the planet life, the sky, all of the elements, the animals, the birds, all were part of God's creation as well. So there was never any distance between science and faith, the church and creation. It all sort of came together. But when I decided to go to seminary, on what was a trial year in seminary, one year test. They were sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation at that point. I did choose to go to the East Coast because of those congregational roots. I wanted to find out what it was like where there was snow on snow. And I spent 10 years back on the East Coast in Connecticut. I did Navy school at Yale, worked as the associate chaplain for Yale after I graduated, and stayed in Middletown, Connecticut for 6 years, and then was called back to the Southwest, to the United Church of Santa Fe, as Joan said many years ago, 1987. The church that I served at that time was a 7-year-old new church start of the United Church of Christ, part of a whole group of new churches that had started by the denomination in the late 70s, early 80s. And I don't know about how the Episcopal Church was doing new church starts at that time, but it was there was a fair amount of hubris, let me put it that way, that if you build it, they will come, 500 members in 5 years, et cetera, et cetera. And it was in that, by the time I came, United had 90 members, 7 years old, gone through a church split, had a $500,000 debt, and a $65,000 a year mortgage payment, but it had an Adobe Tron wall. And it has an acequia fountain that runs across one side of the sanctuary. Acequia, as most of you know, is a Spanish word for irrigation ditch, but it sounds much more romantic in Spanish than it does in English. And so it was a church that initially wanted to ground themselves in being in the desert, high desert Southwest, and that was something that appealed to me. The fact that they wanted a woman minister also appealed to me because my generation of women clergy could not always find jobs, and this was a job that was available. Even though the search committee didn't tell me everything about what some of the challenges were. But I felt, going back to what Joan had reflected on, the oral theology, it was about a year and a half, 2 years into it that I really began to develop what I do call either pinion theology, those scruffy, short pinions that also put down very deep roots and also wrap themselves around rocks in order to withstand the heat, the need for water, and desert winds, or somoral theology, basically overall a desert theology. That the things that last in this place are things that grow slowly, can adapt, put out lots of roots, and also create space for other things, whether it's soils that provide nesting space for birds, or pinions that provide food and nests for all kinds of God's critters. And I do think that going to the questions of climate change and all of that, I think an important one for those of us who are leading congregations or whole dioceses in the Southwest, and for other leaders and people of congregations, is to acknowledge that we need a desert faith. We need a desert faith that is rooted in things like solar power, things like water conservation, your permaculture kind of example, that we have something to teach the wider world about climate change. Because we've been living in deserts for a long time. And also, I don't know Albuquerque as well as in terms of the vagaries of Albuquerque, but certainly Phoenix experienced, the Phoenix metropolitan area experienced microclimate change 20 to 30 years before climate change became a global thing. The summers are hotter, they're longer, there's so much building, there's so much covering of the desert that the heat itself has risen. And that was 20 years before global climate change really kicked in. So I think that those of us who are responsible, whether it's for a local yoga congregation or for an entire diocese or the various groups, the Mexico Conference of Churches, we've got something to teach the wider world about how do you live in a desert place. Because we got to get used to desert because it's going to be a lot more of it. We already know that. And how do we live with faith and not with fear in this changing climatic era? So, anyway, long introduction, but those are my roots. So, where do we go from here? One of the questions that Joan had asked us to talk about, even though she didn't moderate this, she did provide us some questions. That was good. Both of you did. Okay, good.
Yours seems to work.
Okay. If you have a motion, who need worse than. So what do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities of this current time, either locally throughout the region or globally? I mean, I had not known that the Episcopal Diocese stretched into West Texas, and I applaud you for good Episcopalian word, for addressing the issue of what watershed, what basin do we live in? Wow, that takes chutzpah. And it also takes faithfulness.
Yeah, so that one works. Is that better? All right, we're good. So I think I'll begin sort of by talking about our diocese in the context in which I'm serving to identify some of the challenges that I think we're all facing. As was mentioned, our diocese is the full state of New Mexico at the far west part of Texas. So we look after El Paso, and then everything in going out to the Big Bend. So Marfa, Fort Stockton, Talitha, and going out in that way. So almost all of the Permian Basin is in our diocese. And yet, the wealth that has been extracted from that area is not here. And I think that, that's a part of our New Mexico reality. Extraction, uranium, oil, coal, gold, silver. The drive for extraction, rooted in the doctrine of discovery, right, which drove the colonial impetus to come here in the first place. That drive to, and the theology that undermines it, right? There was that sense that doctrine of discovery very much encapsulates. We are able to, and in fact, in some ways, it is our duty to go and extract the resources and use them for the purposes of the gospel. That was kind of the way the theology worked. And that evolved in the way I look at it from kind of a colonial extractive technology became slavery, right? And it was, and we will actually oppress first indigenous peoples here, and then the transatlantic slave trade kicked in so that we will exploit human labor, right? And that very shortly after we decided we weren't going to do that anymore, we figured out how to exploit oil and gas, and have built then the society of extracting and really using up. Not a sense of collaboration, not a sense of working with the land, but very much a kind of, we can use it up and then go find more basic philosophy and ideas. So I think we do, I'm deeply aware as a Christian person and a bishop who walks around dressed like this, that there is much greater awareness today of the painful and shameful legacy of the doctrine of discovery and its theological underpinnings, which drove what we now call economy, which is still. And I said, tell me about that. He said, well, it was right on the sign. It said St. Albans Church in the Anglo-Catholic tradition. And I knew that was a Catholic church for white people. And I was like, that's what the sign said. We put it right out there, right? So that sign is not there anymore. But sort of, it's helping me to see how sort of we are rooted in kind of the English music, the English ways of worship. And if you're Anglo, you might be comfortable with that. But if you grow up here, I mean, no disrespect to the Roman Catholic Church, but I know lots of Roman Catholic folks who wish that the Roman Catholic Church would allow priests to be married, women to be priests, and have an open and affirming approach to LGBT folks. And I'm jumping up and down saying, we're right here, we're doing all that stuff right here with the sacraments and the ancient traditions. But it doesn't feel indigenous to this place for many people who have been born and raised here. And so our church has a lot of work to do culturally. And we haven't even got into the environment piece, but I talk too much, so.
No, but I think that ties in, because part of the culture, whether indigenous or Hispanic Catholic, I would say, has a great deal to teach Protestants who have come from other places, or even who grew up here, how to live with, not in this land, but with this land. And at the same time, we need to be very aware of that it's not appropriation, it's not, or assimilation. It's how do we engage? How do we, say, in worship, for example, how do we incorporate either Hispanic, Catholic liturgies and songs, etc., and or indigenous songs, liturgies, etc., without it being sort of one from column A, one from column B kind of spirituality. And for me, at least, it has to start with relationships. The church I serve is predominantly Anglo. I would say maybe 10 to 15% either Hispanic or indigenous. But and I have to admit that the church was started in Santa Fe, New Mexico. If you go back and look at the historical documents from 1979, 1980, it was started as an Anglo enclave. And the idea was that it would also pick up people who were disenfranchised Hispanic Catholics. Well, when I first came, number one, I am not into sheep stealing. I'm into being the best pastor I can possibly be, and being into the church being the strongest we can be. But I'm not going to dun another faith community in order to grow the one that I serve. And so when I first came, there were a handful of Hispanic persons in the congregation, and because there wasn't a liberal alternative in Santa Fe at that point. But a few years later, Santa Maria del Paz got started with a very liberal, inclusive priest, now Monsignor Jerome Martinez, who went on to be the head of the cathedral. So there was an alternative there for people. And so I said, if you want to, go home. And we'll figure out a partnership with Santa Maria del Paz or with the cathedral. But I'm not going to try to convert you to Protestantism. And I think that helping, and I think because of that, then there can be more trust in terms of developing relationships that we need to develop. And that when you look at northern New Mexico culture, and it is very connected to the land. And the same thing, I mean, the whole Marodomo thing, cleaning out acequias and being in touch with the rhythm of the land, small farms rather than big agribusiness and all those kinds of things. And the same thing is true with the indigenous populations of northern New Mexico or this whole sort of Colorado Plateau area. So I think that starting with church culture is very important to recognize who we are and to enter into those conversations from the standpoint of we have a heck of a lot to learn about all kinds of things, about living with this land and also learning that history of the extractive culture. Because I don't know about Albuquerque and other parts of the state, but Santa Fe is an extractive culture when it comes to spirituality. You know, I'm gonna go to Spanish Market and get all kinds of meat sauces for my house. So I'm gonna go to Indian Market and buy this, that, or the other thing without ever really knowing the spiritual roots of that. And or you know, I'm gonna go to a sweat lodge, or I'm gonna put up a teepee, which is completely out of character. But I think, yeah, the extractive culture that you talk about is one that I think our congregations have to acknowledge.
Just speaking theologically about that, I'm really committed to a theological project of peeling away the colonial stuff from the Christian faith, because I don't think there's any Jesus in that. The way I look at history, it was an alliance of a selfish colonial impetus that created the extraction theology, and all the way along it was uncomfortable. People were trying to explain away the Jesus part to do what they wanted to do to enslave the people and extract the stuff and control and dominate, right? So I think one of the benefits of being in this polycrisis, as the word you used, Joan, which is beautiful, and I'm going to dig into that some more. Part of the beauty of that is that we know that we cannot continue with a theology that's rooted in extraction, control, and dominance, and we're not able to do that anymore. The challenge is, and I think that so I think there's room for a Jesus-based, gospel-based, love your neighbor humility to become again the center of what our faith, the Christian faith, is about. But in order to do that, we've got a lot of unpeeling of the onion to do, because we have for centuries wrapped ourselves in colonialism. And so I'm eager to try to figure out how do we unpeel those layers, and it comes for me from a stance of humility with respect to the earth. I mean, if you look at the scriptures and if you look at how Jesus operated, there was not this sense of power and domination over. It was about collaborating. The the way I read the Garden of Eden piece is human beings were invited into God's creation with a specific role to care and nurture. And it was when we decided to make it, I'm going to get as much as I can get, that's when the sin started. And that's still what we're doing.
Right, and I mean, Jesus was a good Jewish guy. He was deeply rooted in the land of the Hebrew of Torah and of prophets. In the Torah, it says, when you plow your field, or when you cultivate your field, don't do it all the way to the very edges. Leave that big border around both for human beings and for wild animals. You don't join, the prophets railed against agribusiness, if you will. The joining of land to land, the joining of field to field. So that was the ethos that Jesus grew up in. Plus, he was growing up in occupied territory. I think the more we can put Jesus, we can acknowledge that Jesus was in a territory that had been colonized by the Roman Empire. And that's a little bit hard, I think, for some of us to deal with, but I think that again, we have a responsibility as congregations in this Christian tradition to tell the truth about our own origins. And be able to follow Jesus in a way that challenges domination and challenges manifest destiny and challenges all of that doctrine of discovery really isn't a lot hard because it's right there. It's right there in the middle of it. Now, the other challenge, though, that I also see, Michael, is how to help congregations move from individual acts of charity, into social justice. And the same thing is true, I think, with the environmental issue. How to move from recycling to public policy change. Because loving one's neighbor, yes, it happens one-on-one, it happens with my community relating to your community or whatever, but it also gets manifested in the laws, the land use policies, the methane policies, the Permian Basin policies, all those kinds of things. And at least I find that to be a much more difficult nut to crack. I mean, the minute either in an adult forum or certainly in a sermon, at least I start to talk about things like public policy, you can just sort of see people's eyes glaze over, looking at their watches and saying, get me out of here. If I can talk about the individual act of charity, the individual recycling program, then they're on board. But making that leap, which is why I really appreciate the work that Clara, you and you, Joan, do, and others from Interfaith Power and Light do locally and also nationally, because you push us on that. And I think that's, at least, especially when we think about something like climate change or water use, it's policy. So how do you crack that nut?
My sense is that it's easy to love your neighbor if you're in a gated community and you think that neighbor is just the person living next to you. The part of the love your neighbor has to be scaled in the sense that we have to recognize that the things I do, meaning what I eat, what I wear, what I drive, how often I travel, are actually impacting the rest of the earth. And that's a struggle and challenge. Because I think, at least in our churches, what I hear when I start talking about public policy is a couple of things. The Episcopal Church is about half Republican, half Democrat. So I'm always trying to find language that doesn't immediately code as political, which means partisan. Right? So I'm always trying to find moral and biblical language that can speak to my Republican people as well as to my Democratic people. And it's not easy because today everything is about let's polarize and let's make political hay with it, right? So that's true about the border, it's true about the environment, it's true about the Permian transportation is true about water. Like, it's hard now to talk about values when the dominant lens that everybody is picking up to use on anything is politics. And so I think the church has to really establish something other than political language in order to talk about these values pieces. So that's the first piece that I encountered. The second piece I encountered is a broad hopelessness. What can I do? The problem is so huge. I can't fix it, I can't change it. And so I think then the third piece is our churches fall back into the easy ways to pat ourselves on the back and say we did good. I got a letter just yesterday from a very concerned member of one of our churches who said, Bishop, because we are facing decline in population and we're growing older, our budget is being cut, and I'm really disturbed because we used to always have 10% of our budget going to outreach. We're cutting that to 5%, and that means our church will not be able to give grants to our community like before. And I hear the pain in that, but part of what I want to do is stand up and go, well, get out there and work in your community then. Why are we thinking, and I think maybe it's just an Episcopalian thing, but we think like, I'm a member of this church, and this church does these grants for outreach, so I'm good. Pat myself on the back, because hey, our church recycles. We installed solar. We should all be installing solar. We should all be, but to say that is it, and to think that we are done, I think it is hopelessness, because the reality is that one minor change in the farm bill will do more to fix the environment and to do justice than all of our recycling efforts. I mean, a policy change, if we can start doing no-till agriculture, if we can start doing grazing that is not destructive, if we can all eat less meat, that will have a much bigger impact than what we think we're doing by being a part of a church. Particularly I find that the liberal-leaning churches in the Episcopal Church, they're all on board with the recycling. They're all happy about that and voting in a certain way and doing a certain kind of lobbying. But really working with the Republicans in their congregation on how can we establish common ground. That's the hard work of loving our neighbor that's happening in our churches in these same. And I think if we're in churches that lean left, we've got to figure out how to communicate with people who lean right and find some of that common ground. Because the reality is, it is at the policy level that any meaningful change has to come at this point. But the huge obstacle is nobody wants to find solutions. Everybody wants to win the next election by demonizing the other side. And that's, Martin Luther King, right? We will either learn to live together as brothers and sisters and siblings, I have that, or we will die together as fools. We will separate and die. And we're right on the verge of that.
I hate to, it's only one.
I want to hear some questions. I want to hear what you think.
One very quick thing. Going back to desert faith, desert theology. I think that it's not only the doctrine of discovery and excavation and extracting, etc. It is also the deeply rooted fear of the other and of the desert. As Christians, we don't have good desert theology. We don't. If you look even at the biblical story, the Jews, the Israelites, they were desert people. There's 5 or 6 different words in Hebrew for desert that define it. But a Sahara desert's different than a Sonora desert. And that's different than a northern New Mexico Albuquerque desert. There were deserts were named Dan, Gad, Negeb, etc. in Hebrew and in Hebrew scripture. But Jesus was a village boy. He came from Upper Galilee. It had more rain than down in the Judean desert. And by the time you get to fall, he was a complete city boy. He didn't write to the Negev desert. He didn't write to the desert dwellers of Sinai. He wrote to the Romans, the Galatians, the Ephesians, etc. And so our faith itself, and also in Greek, in Koine Greek, there's only one word for desert, eremos, and it's the place you don't want to go to. To this day, we don't know what desert, what the wilderness was that Jesus went to after his baptism. So we have lost, so the desert became the place of trial, temptation, wilderness, etc., the place of fear. And I think a lot of what's driving the way in which the West has developed is that fear. We're going to conquer the desert. We're going to build more dams. We're going to pump more groundwater. We're going to extract oil, gas, silver, whatever, because the desert scares the bejesus out of us. And I think one of the ways of engaging this question, and the same thing I think is true with the whole climate change issue. It's fear, it's hopelessness. What can I do? But I think that our faith offers an understanding of living with the desert, learning its lessons, and living with faith and not with fear. And that for me is where this whole climate change question, environmental, whatever the question is how do we live in a desert time, in a desert place, as the world is getting more desert, with faith and not with fear. Because if I live with fear, then I'm going to get mine and sorry about you. And that's a huge, for me, and that's the theological task of this time.
Well, that's the fear that leads to excess, too.
Absolutely.
It's the fear that there's not enough, and so I need more than enough.
Right.
Because there might be 7 million years.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I think part of our task as faith leaders is to work on helping people embrace a vulnerability that requires us to lean on each other. Because the reality is, true peace comes when everybody has enough. Right? That's when as it says in the Hebrew Bible, the grandparents can sit in peace in the city streets while their grandchildren play in the city streets, and nobody has fear. That only happens when everybody has enough. But the game we're playing right now is I'm going to have way more than enough because I don't think that there will be enough.
That's right.
And that means that others are willing to put out. So the love your neighbor, that's what I mean, the love your neighbor thing has to be scaled because our life is scaled.
Well, Richard, this has been a wonderful conversation. I think it's not ended because we want to open it up to our group here. And this could go on for several hours. Please give us some questions or something when everybody else, so maybe we need to do this in a longer form at some moment. But I'm going to open this up to other questions or conversation. And before I do that, you don't have to answer this question, but maybe you can integrate it into it. You talk about so many things in just such a very, very important, profound, and honest way, which is just very wonderful, very appreciated. The one area, though, is, I think, young adults, young people. And I just want to put that out there, and you can maybe integrate it into some other question conversations here. And Shannon has one here.
So you opened the door for Martin Luther King Jr., and I keep thinking about his letter from Birmingham jail, talking to the churches during the civil rights movement. Where are you with our cause? And we are living right next to an oasis of indigenous wisdom. I believe our state probably has more indigenous people than any other in the United States. And how can we, as those churches during the civil rights movement, often poorly, according to Martin Luther King Jr., but how can we help part the waters so that that indigenous wisdom that knows how to heal this earth can be forefront? And we are marginal to that conversation, but as people of faith, we have got to open that space with our people so that that can come forefront. I just wanted to offer that.
Okay, great question. We have folks online, and so I'm not sure if you could just kind of reframe that before answering the question to make sure that they got it as well.
Sure. The question that was asked was about, was again an acknowledgement that we in New Mexico are living with and among indigenous people who cared for the earth without destroying it for centuries, literally, and still have an earth-based wisdom that has been, these are my words, not your words, but have been sort of actively worked against by at least certain parts of Christian theology. And not, like, I'll say again, I want to recapture the parts of Christian theology that are not about extraction and colonialism and dominance. Because I think, as I read what Jesus was talking about, he was speaking from an oppressed minority position, advocating for a society based on love, not on power and dominance and control. So when the Christian tradition embraced power, dominance, and control and then tried to Christianize it, I think that's been the problem for the last 1,000 years, roughly. The question was about indigenous wisdom and how we can connect. And to me, the biggest challenge, again, looking like I look, dressing like I dress, is that the Christian tradition has been so wrapped in colonial oppression that quite rightly, many of our Puebloan neighbors are not all that eager to talk to us anymore. And there are ways, right? But I think what we tend to do, at least in my understanding of my Christian tradition, what we tend to do is outreach and mission projects to help those poor people, right? Which is more of the toxic charity, which you were referring to before, and it comes from that sense of a cultural sense of superiority and dominance. And I think part of the change of heart that we have to begin to embrace, and to me this is a fundamental Christian practice, is to let go of the need for dominance and control, to open ourselves to vulnerability in the sense that we need to work together. And only from that genuine humility place can we then reapproach our neighbors and say, we're really not about all that you've experienced from us before. And we're coming to ask for wisdom and guidance and to develop a kind of companionship that has not existed in the history between Christian peoples and indigenous peoples in this part of the country. With rare exceptions. I mean, I think there are exceptions and there are, we have to acknowledge that many of the indigenous peoples are also Roman Catholic or Presbyterian or even Episcopal in this part of the world. But I think that question of how do we listen to the indigenous wisdom when so much of our history has been about stomping out that very culture. That's our biggest challenge. But I think it's also a wonderful opportunity. Because in those moments when we have as you well know, we have a very special relationship with the Episcopal Church in Navajo land. And the Episcopal clergy and lay leaders who are also Navajo people are leading our church into different ways of choosing who will be their bishops and who will be their clergy. They're teaching us different ways of how power and leadership are exercised that's more community-based and collaborative than our kind of election system. So there's a lot for us to learn on every level, including about how do we care for the earth and acknowledge the rhythms, the natural rhythms, instead of trying to replace that. I was struck by this, particularly because of the big eclipse yesterday, which by the way, because the eclipse happened on the East Coast, all of a sudden it was news, right? I was like, we got one just a couple months ago, y'all didn't know. But we're out here in the West where they don't listen, right? But I'm also aware that for the Diné, for the Navajo people, you don't go outside during the eclipse because you react in awe. And what I saw from the Anglo culture was like literally cheering, like
Go team.
learning about the kind of cultural interaction from a place of humility is something that I think we need to embrace. But it's really got to change our heart. I mean, I'm growing more. Every day I'm more and more aware of my whiteness and my maleness and my Christianness and my bishopiness and how that is experienced. And I'm trying to learn how to be quieter. which is a shock to you all because I've been yakking all my life.
Okay,
So,
go
it's
ahead.
such a good thing.
One way that we try to do that with United is that we don't call them mission trips anymore. We don't even call them service trips. When we go out to the Good Shepherd Mission in Navajo Land, in Fort Defiance, because we have a 25-year relationship with that church and that community. They're education trips, they're immersion trips. It's what do we need to learn? There may be some kind of service element to it, but it really is helping both our youth and adults learn about the long walk, learn about how the four sacred mountains, learn about begin to at least learn about the wisdom that you're talking about, and not even presume that we're there on quote a mission, nor are we really there even to do service. We're there to learn. And also to have an ongoing relationship with another community. And similarly with the Table Women United up in Santa Fe, Espanola area, and other places to just to build on what you were saying, Michael, about coming in from a state of, from a place of humility. And what we have to offer maybe is monetary support. But it's not that we're gonna, it's not that we're going to come in with all of our great ideas about this, that, or the other. And monetary support with no strings attached. So it's and learning. So
Right. You know, I was going to talk, but folks on the stage indicate that about 5 minutes even for another question or two. If you have to go,